The Sony FS5 is one of my favorite cameras of all time. It has amazing image quality, it has one of the best ergonomics I ever used in a video camera. It has internal electronic ND filters. They can set the auto, so depending on your exposure changing, it will adjust the ND filter on it. It has amazing slow motion capabilities. With this camera, you can shoot up to 960 frames per second. So should you get one in 2024? No. When the Sony FS5 first came out, it was a revolutionary camera. It was a prosumer camera that had an interchangeable lens on it. It shot amazing 10-bit 1080p footage with the camera, and it had the Sony E-mount on it, which was at the time was a very new lens mount. But the cool thing about the Sony E-mount was that it was a mirrorless mount that you can adapt other lenses to it. So a lot of people had, they're like Canon or Nikon lenses, and by getting adapters, you were able to use them on this camera. That sounds like a great deal since you're getting pretty much a $7,000 camera for around, $2,000 to $1,500. But honestly, nowadays you have better choices. Now, the FS5 is still really good when it comes to most things. Now, I still use this camera for a lot of the shoots I do. I usually use this camera as a B cam nowadays, and I use the Sony A7 IV that we're shooting this right now as the A cam. Now, when it comes to the image quality, like this camera still, you can get great looking footage out of it. And you can actually shoot 4K video with the camera also, even though it'll be 8-bit, but to be honest, it's not that big of a deal. It still looks great. And the 1080p out of this camera is also great. So paired up with a camera like the Sony A7 IV, you can get great looking footage, and then you can grade it later in post to have them look pretty much the same. Now, the problem with this camera, and it might seem like an insignificant problem, which is for me the main reason why I don't really use this camera that much at all anymore, is going to be the autofocus. Now, this camera does have autofocus. It's just that it doesn't have this newer Sony phase detect autofocus. It has the old contrast detect autofocus, which I find it to be really weird because they put a contrast based autofocus on the FS5, which is weird because this camera came out in 2015, while a camera like the original Sony A7 with its full frame sensor has phase detect autofocus on it, while this camera has contrast based autofocus. Okay, so this is going to be an image slash autofocus test with the Sony FS5, and we're using the Tamron 17 to 28 millimeters, and the reason for that is the Tamron lenses from all the lenses I have tested work the best when it comes to the autofocusing system on this camera. When it comes to some other lenses, it just doesn't autofocus, or it focuses for a second and it stops focusing, so it's very picky. But the Tamron lenses, which I absolutely love, work the best from the tests I have done. You can see a full autofocusing test I have done with this camera in previously, but as you can see, it does a pretty good job of just keeping me in focus. Right here, I think it struggled a little bit, but in a scene like this where like the background there isn't much going on, it's hard to tell if the camera is struggling with the focus in it when there is a lot of focus. Now, the difference between those two are going to be how the camera focuses. With the phase detect autofocus, you can pretty much focus on the subject and stay in focus, like how we're doing right now. It's using A7 IV's phase detect. It's keeping me perfectly in focus the whole time. I can go out, come in, it perfectly keeps me in focus. The FS5 cannot do this. And even if it gets you perfectly in focus, what happens is that it has to constantly pulse back and forth to make sure you're in focus. So your image always is kind of out of focus. So because of that reason, this camera, you really cannot use it with the autofocus. The autofocus is only really good for getting the initial focus, locking it in, and then staying there. Now, this wasn't a huge issue back in 2015 when this camera came out, because back then there weren't that many fast lenses out there, and a lot of people honestly didn't shoot with fast lenses. With a Super 35 sensors, a lot of times people will shoot at f2.8, f4 with their cameras. But nowadays we have so many great options by first party lens companies and even third party lens companies. There are super fast lenses, like we're shooting with an f1.8 lens, and we can get great looking images with it. Back in the day when it came to video, a lot of times they wouldn't shoot with fast lenses really. Back in the day you wouldn't really shoot with fast lenses that much because you didn't have autofocus. You had to make sure your subject is in focus. A lot of times you didn't really do shallow depth of field unless if it was like a really specific scene. Nowadays anyone can have shallow depth of field. It's really easy to do, and you just set it up, and then boom, the camera will just autofocus instantly. Now, obviously, if you're making like YouTube videos or stuff, obviously for that stuff, the FS5 isn't really good. But even for like doing professional video, I like using autofocus with these newer cameras. The reason for that is because people move. Now, the reason why I use autofocus is a lot of times I am shooting, shallow depth of field, and in those scenarios, you really need a camera with autofocus. If you have manual focus, even if you nail the focus, people move their head back and forth when they're talking, or maybe they're leaning to say something. When in any of those scenarios, if you're shooting shallow depth of field, the person would have to stand perfectly still in order to be in focus. That's why whenever I shoot, I just use the A7 IV as the main camera, and I'll have the FS5 on the side as a B cam. And when it comes to the image quality between these two cameras, they're pretty comparable. The A7 IV is going to be a lot sharper because it has a higher resolution sensor, and when it comes to low light, A7 does way better. FS5 only really works well if you have a perfectly exposed scene. Whenever you're in a dark area where you have to bump up the ISO, the image quality does fall apart with the FS5. With the A7 IV, you can go super high with the ISO and still get a clean image. When it comes to shooting S-Log, A7 IV is super easy to shoot with. You pretty much just shoot it how you would normally, and then you bring it to your software, and then you edit it, and it's super easy, and it's very flexible. Even if you overexpose it or underexpose it, you can fix it later in post. It's almost like a raw footage out of the A7 IV, while with the FS5, you have to have it exposed perfectly for it to look good. And by exposed perfectly, I mean that the footage has to be shot at 1.5 stops overexposed for it to work with S-Log 2. Now this one does have S-Log 3, but S-Log 3 in my opinion doesn't look that well with the FS5, so that's why I shoot with the S-Log 2. But with S-Log 2, you have to shoot it overexposed, and when you're looking at your footage through the screen, it looks overexposed. If you're using an external monitor, it also looks overexposed and washed out, so it makes it very hard to shoot with the FS5 is what I'm saying. But there are a lot of positives with this camera also. You have built-in XLRs and great amplifiers on this camera, so you get great audio out of it. You have external battery on this camera, so you can just get giant batteries on this camera like this one right here. Like you can't get giant batteries like this on the on the Sony A7 cameras. So if you're planning on shooting for a long time continuously, you can do that with this camera. You also have an AC plug in this camera, so you can just run it just straight out of the wall. You have built-in ND filters on this camera, so that when you're shooting outside, you don't have to worry about putting in an ND filter or bumping up your shutter speed. And also with this camera, this is one of the last cameras that Sony made that has this super high frame rate. Now what this camera has is like a buffering mode. So what that does is that you can just continuously pretty much shoot with the camera, and then when something crazy happens, then you can record the last 5 seconds in like super high frame rates. So you can, for example, you could be bird watching with the camera, and then the bird like flies off, and then you press the record button, it records the last 5 seconds, and then slows it down within the camera, and then when you go back home, you have like 1,000 frame rate video. It's super crazy and super useful. And honestly, the image quality isn't that great on it, but for some reason Sony has completely given up on that program for some reason. With their newer cameras, they just have like the standard 120 frames per second. I believe with the A7S III it can go up to 240 frames per second on HD. But this camera that came out in 2015, it can do 240 frames, it can do 480 frames, which looks pretty good, and it has 960 frames, which doesn't look that good, but it's still cool that it's capable of doing that. I don't know why they completely removed that in their newer cameras, and even the FX6 that came out recently, well, not recently, it's been a couple of years now, but that camera can only shoot up to 120 and 240 frames per second, so this is the last camera that can do that. Now the problem is that there's so many other options when it comes to buying cameras nowadays. And in that $1,500 to $2,000 range, there's so many great cameras out there. If we stick with Sony, you have the FX30, which is also going to be a Super 35 sensor that's going to give you all the newest Sony features on it. And then you're going to have the amazing autofocus, which I'm telling you is super important when it comes to shooting any type of video. You can also go with an A7 IV, which is my favorite video camera. That's also going to be around like $2,000, maybe $2,500 if you get it brand new. And obviously, if you can afford it for $6,000, you can get yourself a brand new Sony FX6, which is going to be a lot better than this camera. Honestly, when it comes to the image quality, it's not going to be like super different, but you're gonna have the better low light performance. You're gonna have great autofocus with that camera, and then it has like some other features, like it has like catalyst browse, like stabilization in the camera. So obviously that's going to be a better choice. And if you go outside of Sony, you know, Canon has great options, Blackmagic has amazing options when it comes to shooting video, so it makes it a really hard buy to buy the FS5. The only reason I would buy an FS5 is like if you're shooting conferences where you will need to shoot for a very long time and you need an interchangeable lens camera, but there's so many other options when it comes to that space that, like, with the FS5, I just don't see a reason to recommend it to anyone, really. But it's still a great camera, and whenever you show up to any shoot with this camera, everyone's always impressed with this camera. Any of your clients will be impressed to, you know, have a big camera that you can shoot them with, even though your smaller camera probably gets better images out of it. But I do love this camera a lot. But the thing is that if you can find a great deal on this camera, it's still a great camera, especially if you're just getting into video production. If you can grab this camera for like, I don't know, like $1,000 or something, then it would be definitely be a great buy. You can take some great video with it. It's just that there are so many other great cameras out there now for shooting video. But anyways, guys, thanks for watching this video. Hopefully it was useful. If you have any questions about the Sony FS5 or anything, just let me know in the comments. And if you disagree with me, if you think this is still a great buy, then let me know in the comment section. And, you know, if I agree with you, I'll pin your comment. But anyways, guys, thanks for watching, and I'll see you guys in the next video. Goodbye.